Every tyranny begins with the promise of permanence. They never say they will rule for a season or for a generation. They say forever. They say their empire will last 1,000 years. They say their order is eternal, unshakable, destined. That is how the Endarkenment sells itself. By presenting domination not as a temporary seizure of power, but as the natural state of the world. And yet, history has rendered its verdict. No fascist state has endured for more than 2 decades. Every eternal regime collapses under the weight of its own foundation, because fear, propaganda, coercion, and force are not stone. They are sand. This is not just a lesson of history, it is a law of nature. Systems built on coercion are brittle because they require constant energy to hold people in line. The Endarkenment promises stability through terror, but terror is the least stable form of control. People will obey under the lash, but not forever. Fear produces silence, not consent. Silence can look like stability, but it is only the pause before the inevitable break. Once the fear weakens, once the coercion falters, once the propaganda wears thin, the structure collapses. Suddenly, violently, and always faster than the rulers believed possible. The Enlightenment showed us the opposite, that liberty, when made material, is self-reinforcing. A society where needs are met without hierarchy doesn't require propaganda to justify itself, because people can see their own dignity reflected in daily life. That's the difference. The Endarkenment spends endless resources trying to maintain a lie. Enlightenment systems invest in truth that sustains itself. It is the contrast between trying to dam a river with bare hands and building a channel that lets the river flow. One requires constant force. The other requires design. Look closely at every Endarkenment project and you'll see the same pattern. They rise quickly because fear is efficient at the beginning. They mobilize propaganda. They silence opposition. They create spectacles of unity. For a brief moment, it can look like strength, but it's an illusion. It's the rigidity of glass, shiny, intimidating, but prone to shatter. The French Revolution's terror, the fascist regimes of the 20th century, the cult states that promise purity and destiny, they all cracked within a generation. The very tools they used to build control became the acids that dissolved it. Propaganda breeds disillusion when reality fails to match it. Force breeds resistance with every life it crushes. Fear breeds desperation that eventually outgrows its chains. The Endarkenment fails because it misunderstands human nature. It assumes people can be ruled indefinitely, as if they are machines requiring only programming and discipline. But human beings are not machines. They are conscious, rational, creative, and above all, aware of dignity. Even when crushed, even when silenced, people carry within them the knowledge that their suffering is unjust. That ember cannot be extinguished by terror. It waits, it smolders, and when the moment comes, it ignites. That is why every system that claims eternal control dies sooner than it expects. The ember survives longer than the empire. From an Enlightenment socialist perspective, the test of a system is whether it outputs liberty by default. If it requires endless justification, endless censorship, endless violence to sustain itself, then it is already in decay. The Enlightenment's wager was that reason and dignity, when made the ground of society, do not require force to preserve them. They reinforce themselves. Education, abundance, shared sovereignty. These do not demand silence. They invite speech. They do not require obedience. They nurture cooperation. They do not fear the future. They build for it. And because of that, they endure. The Endarkenment has always tried to disguise its fragility with spectacle. The parades, the uniforms, the chants, the promises of a millennium. All of it is theater designed to convince both rulers and ruled that the empire is eternal. But spectacle does not add strength to a crumbling foundation. Rome called itself eternal, and it fell. The Third Reich declared 1,000 years, and it crumbled in 12. Every tyrant writes eternity into their propaganda because deep down they know the truth. Their power cannot last without lies. That is why our task is not just to resist the Endarkenment, but to expose its lie, to show that a system of fear cannot endure, and that liberty designed into infrastructure of society is the only permanence worth trusting. Because permanence is not built by decree. It is built by removing the conditions that make masters necessary. When food, shelter, and knowledge flow without gatekeepers, the throne has no function. When survival is not dependent on authority, authority withers. And in that world, liberty ceases to be temporary. It becomes the natural condition of life. The lesson of history is simple. The Endarkenment always claims forever, but forever has never belonged to them. Their reigns collapse before the lives of a single generation are spent. They are remembered not as eternal orders, but as warnings. The Enlightenment, by contrast, continues to live because it is not a promise of eternity through domination, but a framework for liberty through design. That is why it endures. That is why it will endure for millennia to come. The Endarkenment builds its castles on sand, and the tide always comes. The Enlightenment builds its foundations in reason, in dignity, in the sovereignty of the people. That is stone. That is bedrock. And that is the only ground upon which freedom can last.